how should architects and engineers work together? You're going to hear what collaboration looks like for Arch11 and KL&A. These firms design projects together across all phases. For example, this is their Roth Living headquarters project in Denver. The building does what a lot of designers aspire to do. It creates connectivity. It blurs the boundaries between the inside and the outside space, between public and private space. These are values that most designers are seeking from their buildings and in the way that they work with others in the design process. Joining us today is architect turned CEO of Monograph, Robert Ewan. 6 years ago, Robert started Monograph to make project management and business easier for architects and engineers. And now over 12,000 architects and engineers use Monograph to work smarter and faster. Ken Andrews is here from Arch11 out of Boulder and Denver. They deliver artful and resilient design across residential, commercial, and institutional scales. Ken is a principal and partner and has been with the firm for over 20 years. He brings deep design leadership, a strong focus on integrating new technology into the design process. Jeff Myers joins us from KL&A Engineers and Builders. KL&A is a 30-year-old firm generating $40 to $50 million a year across 5 offices in the Rocky Mountain region. They're known for integrated service delivery mindset. Jeff is an executive principal engineer there with 25 years of structural engineering experience, and he oversees engineering operations at the firm. Fun fact, before Jeff's engineering degree, he graduated with an architecture degree. So he has a particular appreciation for architectural concerns as an engineer. So I'm going to kick things off with, how did you all start working together?
Jeff and I were trying to remember this the other night when we were chatting, and it's probably one of 2 ways. Either EJ Mead, my partner, and Greg Kingsley, who's the founder of KL&A, knew each other, introduced Jeff and I, or Jeff and I were on a mountain bike ride together. There's a architecture, engineering, and construction mountain bike ride that happens here on the Front Range every Wednesday night during the summer. And I have a feeling 15 years ago or so, Jeff and I met each other somewhere on the trail, climbing up Lookout Mountain or something. So, Jeff, I don't know if you came to any other.
Yeah, no, we were tossing back and forth which one it was, but yeah, it was quite some time ago for sure.
Guys, I want to be part of that mountain bike ride.
Come on out. I'll find you a bike.
Like, love to ask, like, what kind of projects do both of your firms like focus on? Love to get a little bit more insight in terms of like the balance between project types and project workload.
Well, as I kind of joke with a lot of people, we take on interesting projects. And I don't necessarily mean that to be condescending, but it's like things that are of interest to us, that are culturally engaged to our mission and our vision, and that have clients that are willing to go along for the ride of what it takes to make wildly specific architecture and investigate all the specifics that go along with that. And so, over the 30 years that our firm, Arch11's been in business, we've done everything from kitchen renovations and pop tops to 65,000 square foot high schools to manufacturing facilities to whatnot. But our current sweet spot is the high-end custom residence, the modern residence in particular, which we now have projects all over the country. And Jeff, we work with Jeff on a large portion of those.
Yeah, that's definitely one of our, I think, in a structural market and a niche markets for us is the high-end residential. Some of what we call the ridiculous high-end residential. And it's really fun, challenging. Sometimes those projects are more challenging technically and collaboration-wise and everything than a large building. But we also do everything from civic type work, libraries, schools, K-12 and higher ed, museums. We do a lot of, there's a lot of growth in Colorado population-wise, and so we're doing a lot of multi-unit residential as well. Yeah, I'd say we don't do a lot in the industrial realm, but otherwise, if it's vertical, we're in the market.
So across those interesting projects, and then even focusing in on the really high-end residential, what's your thinking on how you structure this, like in terms of phases? Do you find that there's like really common phase structure despite the typology? I'd love to hear if it's just totally in sync with how each of you think about the project structure, or if maybe the structural engineering view of the project structure is somewhat a little different than the architect, given that the engineer doesn't have as much scope as the architect.
Yeah, and I think from us, we work with lots of architects, right? And I think the general structure of, concept, schematic design, DD, CD, construction phase services, kind of the industry norm, just because everybody kind of speaks that vocabulary. For us, what we try to teach our young engineers and our project managers is to ask the deeper question about what are we trying to achieve, right? What's the essence of the question at hand for schematic design or for 50% CD? What's that set of drawings going to be used for? Pricing? Is it going to be used for starting foundation shop drawings? Just to, be curious to ask all of the stakeholders, all of the team members about what do they need to have in that set of drawings. And then we can craft our deliverable to help answer their specific questions. A pricing set is different from a construction set.
Yeah, I think to add to that, a very long time ago, Jeff and I might even started having these conversations is like the nature of integrated project delivery, which I know that's a whole big label in terms of how that gets done. And there's a whole model for it that includes joint ventures and all that kind of stuff. But we at Arch11 have definitely leaned into collaboration as something that starts at the inception of a project. We get the benefit of having first contact with the client and having the preliminary ideas and whatever kind of preconceptions that might come out of that. But we pride ourselves with bringing our consultants to the table as quickly and early as possible. Especially a lot of the projects that Jeff and I have done together are adaptive reuse projects. And in that particular case, there's a need for a bunch of analysis of the building right up front, understanding the constraints and the assets of the building. But even when it's ground up, many times the very first conversations that Jeff and I are having aren't even structural. They're conceptual. They're what does the building want to do? What is the urban response? What is the transparency like? What is the feat, the complexity of how we're going to float something over a river or over whatever? And that's the first step to setting the tone for what we want to accomplish. And I think that also sets the tone before we've ever made any decisions. Is this a steel building? Is it a wood building? It's a jellied box at that point, right? There's nothing to it yet. And we come to the table together to figure out what that was going to look like. And I think that's what, to me, that's, SD, DD, all those phases, that's industry standard. We use those. But I think for us, it's much more about how we have the conversations and develop the first principles of the project together, which is most important. And sometimes, our work is about discovery and revealing a site of a location of a system, whatever. And a lot of times those conceptual questions are still happening well into design development and even CDs at times.
And I personally really appreciate all those early conversations, like Ken said, before we're even talking about structural stuff, right? That helps me understand what's sacred to Ken or maybe sacred to his client, right? And how I can get my team here to appreciate those things and have a deeper sense of the why behind what it is that we're doing rather than just sizing beams and columns.
So incredible to hear both of you talk about collaboration in a very integrated process that really is in service to the ethos of the project. I think, the takeaway I got from both of you talking about it is like there's no such thing as coming in too early. It's so important to kind of get together as early as possible to ensure that everyone's perfectly aligned.
Well, I think you hit it on the head, Robert. As for us, it's the project is a priori. Everything is about the project. We're Arch11 for a reason. It's not about the individual's name. It's about us as a collaborative. And our entire mission is to support the project in every option. In fact, it's kind of an interesting thing for our younger staff and other people. We're willing to make changes and do things late in a project process if it's for the betterment of the project. And sometimes it can be frustrating, but the number one issue is that we're making the project better in service of the project.
And I'd even extend that it's not just the engineering being brought on early that a project can benefit from early on, right? Any of the other collaborators, the general contractors, the
Mm.
steel subcontractor, right, that can help you understand what the procurement universe is thinking right now, right? What's the rumor mill on the street with tariffs and all that kind of stuff, right? Having more knowledge at your fingertips to ask questions and to help guide a process is worth its weight in gold, right?
I so strongly align with like how both of you work is incredible. It's also a personal belief, and I'd love to ask a question around like how do you think about structuring time, adding rigor, adding discipline to that process in service to the project? As a young designer, me reflecting back, I think some of the earlier mistakes I've made as a young architect is I am 100% dedicated to the project, but I have also lacked the rigor and the discipline needed to ensure that I'm also in service to the business as well. But there are other variables at stake other than doing an incredible design project. How do you think about structuring your time?
Well, that's a good question. I think Jeff has actually always been a really good advocate for time to me because, as the architect and a lot of times the prime or the client, we're always being pushed for schedule. And it's become a habit now that whenever I propose a project, I always run the schedule by Jeff and all my other consultants to make sure that it's in line with their workflow in order for them to get what they need to do. And it's always been a really good push back and forth for us to figure that out. But I think it also comes back to I'm sure everybody's heard the rote adage about the three-legged stool of budget, time, and quality in any given project, and you can't have all three, quote unquote. I think, Jeff and I have talked about this a lot before too, is like, well, we strive to actually have all three. You just have to be honest and upfront with it and figure it out up front. And I think time is one of those things that more and more trying to recognize that it's a finite resource, but we have to, if we want excellence in our work, we have to have the amount of time that we need to do it. And a lot of times, if we have more time to do it, we can actually get a better budget and we get the quality that we're all expecting. And I think we just have to set that tone up front with clients and developers and even general contractors that while there might be a premium for duration, you might have savings on the budget when it's all said and done, and you're going to get the quality that everyone's aspiring for if you can manage that expectation.
I've heard the three-legged stool analogy many, many times. I always give this feedback. If you take away a leg, is it really a good stool?
Yeah,
Oh, like I would argue, like I wouldn't want to sit on that.
yeah,
Uh,
right.
you do need all three legs.
I've
Um,
come to the same conclusion, but it's still an apt analogy that everybody always wants to talk about. So we should keep all three legs, right?
yes, like
Yeah.
it's to behave like a stool, and I would, you would like it to function where someone can sit on it without the fear of falling down.
Totally.
Jeff, I was curious, do you think about time the same way as well?
Yeah, definitely. Like Ken said, he's always very gracious and talking through the schedule very early on in the project, of which it's really beneficial. It helps us plan for it down the path, get our internal team here queued up for it, knowing it's coming, as a sub consultant, everybody else's fires become your fire, your problem. And so Ken's always open to talking through whatever the situation is. If we need more time, all right, well, let's talk about it. What does it mean? How does that influence or impact other people? He's always, I don't know, just really easy to work with, saying, okay, I understand the situation. Here's what I'm up against. How can we work together for a win-win situation?
Jeff said the word curiosity earlier. I think that's something that he and I talk a lot about and resonates is that just as I'm as much curious about the structural assembly of a building, I'm also very curious about how we're going to deliver it. And so parts of that would be what is the drop dead deadline that we need to have in order to make a decision about what the shape of this is? What do we need to know in terms of which system we're going to use? And Arch11 and KL&A, almost every project, we're exploring several different systems. I can't think of one where we haven't had a high, low, middle of systems for aesthetics, innovation, budget, etc. So there's a lot of really intense work in the pre-design and schematic design around that we're trying to hone in on. And then we have to have a lot of contractor involved for valuing that, so those different systems as well, for us to make a decision on how we're going to go forward. So that all takes a lot of time, and it all leads to the quality that we're yearning for.
Let's say you have this like drop dead date on a decision on form, but you're working in parallel on a few different systems leading into that. And because you're working between firms and you're relying on each other step by step, what tactically are you doing by pattern to try to communicate and get really aligned so that you can hit that time?
I come from a project management background in construction. So like schedules are ideally king, but it almost never happens, especially as architects and a team of creatives, which I recognize that sort of double-edged sword. So I think as my consultants many times are a huge part of keeping us because we have to give things to them for them to do their job to come back to us. So that back and forth is always what sets, I think, the more rigorous deadlines than what we would attempt to do with ourselves. Because there's always, as an architect, you always want to do more. It could be 11th hour, 3 o'clock in the morning, the deadline's the next morning, and I want to do this. And, okay, well, I guess I'm not going to sleep tonight because I want to do that. Whether that's as bad as that pattern and habit is, I wouldn't suggest that be the system or the pattern that you're talking about, right? I think we need to sort of break that pattern more than anything. But so I think it's just really about communication with your entire team and managing an entire team. And since this conversation is about collaboration, I mean, that's the root of collaboration is communication. It's not going to be a very good collaboration if you're siloing yourself and then turning around and handing it to somebody and say, here, now do this. And I think that's really the crux of it is just being vulnerable, developing trust with your team and expecting them to push back and say, we can or can't do that. And if they're going to say they can't do it, then, obviously the understanding of why and what I can do as an architect to help them out. And they turn around and do the same, how they can help me out. So, I mean, I don't think there's like any special sauce to it other than just that level of trust and communication and the relationships that you're building with your team outside of your own practice.
Yeah, I 100% agree. It's the communication piece, right? You can develop tools. You can spend $50,000 on a tool, or you can use a pen and piece of trace paper to lay out a schedule and kind of agree to milestones and deliverables and the intent, the essence of what a deliverable is about. And it really comes down to, for Ken and I, and this is, maybe because I'm approaching 50 here, years of age, that I pick up the phone and I just start asking questions and trying to search for clarity and curiosity, the reason why behind it.
Absolutely.
Because we have an internal team here at KL&A that I want them to be up to speed and understand the why behind it as well.
Yeah, that's actually really, I'm sure you guys talk about this too with the generational aspects of communication and schedule management collaboration huge. With COVID, we've all leaned into using Teams and remote working, and I don't think anybody picks up the phone anymore. Everything is now a Teams chat or a Zoom call or whatever, but it's also an ongoing, never-ending chat stream. But like Jeff, I'm now over 50, and picking up the phone is always the best thing. In having those conversations, I personally prefer a face-to-face as much as time-consuming as it can be. Which is the nice thing with Zoom and the virtuals is that we can jump online and we can sketch and do things. But there's still nothing like just sitting down with a piece of trace paper or a piece of paper going through things and explaining it graphically with, that kind of thing. So I would say if there's a framework, if we can, not to sound conservative, but if we can preserve that level of craft and creativity, that'd be amazing. I haven't been convinced by any of the virtual tools yet that have done better than the in-person, but I'm also open to new technologies and always striving to do something new.
Yeah. For me, there's something about being together, right? This allows us to be together because we have some constraints of geographic constraints here, but sitting down together and brainstorming, problem solving is I don't know. It fuels me, partially maybe because I'm a little older, but it for me, that's really the secret sauce to really working well together is sitting down, building that trust with one another.
And I would say one other thing is we've always been a challenge of like managing a team internally is also our own resources and our availability and time. Jeff's been a good mentor for me too about this, about time blocking your team so that your team is available and focused on something, and being transparent with me about when his team is available to work on something because they've got numerous projects just like we do. And I would say for us, as we adopted Monograph, that's actually one of the things that's become really strong for us is that we have a weekly meeting at the end of the week looking at people's resources and their time. And then we plan that for the next week so that we use Monograph now to make sure people are available for that week, not on another project, etc.
I feel like both of you are like must be secretly like tagging along. This has been a topic for me this entire week as I run around my company here at Monograph, just telling everyone just get on the phone.
Yeah.
Everyone's like writing a DM message and waiting for a reply, or writing an email and waiting for a reply. It's like, you know what's the fastest way to get a reply? Like just get on the phone.
It's
Yeah.
there's a problem, and my team is like, well, I've emailed them 2 or 3 times. Like, now it's time to call.
Like, it's fascinating because obviously we're a technology company. I'm absolutely excited about the technology and the innovation that we are doing. And then broadly speaking, that like the broader tech industry is starting to innovate on. But there's some practices that like it should not go away. These are all add-ons. Like get in person if you can. It's always
Yeah.
if you can't do that, get on the phone. These are things that I don't believe that will ever go away. And it does require strong leadership to remind the team, use all the tools you have at your disposal. You now have more tools, which is
Yeah.
amazing, but use them all. You shouldn't rely overly on one, and don't forget about the other tool sets that you have at your disposal.
I think we talked about this the other night, Ken, is there's a theme we're seeing that we're losing the humanistic touch in the office, right? People want to come, do a job, and leave, right? Which is great. I love the work and the non-work portions of life and that balance. And when they can blend together, I think that can be a really special space to live in. But a lot of the same, I want to say, a lot of the same, behaviors, desires to sit with your friends, meet with your friends, hang out with them. I encourage the younger people out there to use those same skill sets in your career, in your professional life. That's what's going to, make all the connections and develop trust and help you really develop this sense of collaboration with one another.
Trust, collaboration, relationships. It's such an important topic that I do think we're all four of us are in leadership roles now, and so important for us to just continue to advocate for the next generation of leaders that like not only technically you should be proficient in your role, but invest in your relationships. They will take you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
that's huge. I think Jeff and I are having the same conversations with both of our teams serendipitously at the same time. And it's top of mind for sure.
To some degree, I think we've been talking about it constantly, and the light bulb went off for me many years ago. It really makes a difference. Definitely does.
If you were to give advice to the next generation of leaders, practitioners, engineers, architects, and how they should work together and build that relationship from the ground up, are there any other key takeaways other than invest in that personal time with each other?
Yeah, I mean, invest in that personal time, but also, seeking to build that trust, be vulnerable. That's one thing I think Ken helps me realize sometimes that he's being vulnerable a lot to me to try and understand what it is I'm trying to talk about or what we're trying to do. So he's very patient with me and gives me a lot of grace to stumble around in my explanation of things. So I can totally move mountains if you can come with that grace.
Yeah, I think it's imperative that good collaborators understand the first principles of each other and of a project. I think it's very easy to, what do they say? They say you make your snap judgment of somebody in the first 30 seconds that you meet them. I think it's really important to recognize, especially in a professional environment, that you don't always get to choose who you get to collaborate with and who you have to collaborate with. And you have to overcome that snap judgment because there's some really amazing people out there that may not be what you think they are in 30 seconds, but you get to know them and they're really deep, really powerful collaborators, really great human beings. And you got to have that openness and that vulnerability with yourself to say, okay, this may not be somebody that I would socialize with all of the time out in the world or be best friends with, but man, can I get a really great project together out of them and we can have an amazing professional relationship. And just really working to do that is really important. I think it's even better when you do find somebody that you're good friends with, and that you can celebrate the project welcomely or understand how they're raising their kids or what's going on in their life. And it's interesting, the younger generation seems to really try to put the silo on work and personal life. the whole life-work balance. I personally like to look at it as life-work integration. Like the kind of all spheres are relative to each other and they flow into each other. Not to say that I have my family and I do stuff with there and I have professionals and I have my friends, but so much of it's also intertwined. And some of my best friends are people that I've met on construction sites and in work. And yeah, I think it's just really important to be there. It's funny that Jeff says that I'm patient. I don't think most people would describe me as being very patient, but I'll take it. So.
I love the word work-life integration. I usually prefer the word work-life harmony. And I think it's mostly because I have a hard time accepting the word balance. Mostly because I think the general assumption of how you define balance is a 50-50 split. And I think it's very rare in life where you do 50-50 split or it's ever that clean in terms of a 50-50 split. And the word harmony makes a lot more sense to me.
Yeah, definitely.
I'd love to get into the details of some of your project experiences. So we talked about one of your projects, the headquarters in Denver. But when you think about like all of your time working together, what's one project that really stood out as something that tested your collaboration, and how'd you get through it?
That's in our collaboration. In some ways, they all do, right? That's really what it comes down to is I'm definitely a very strong-willed individual. I know that, and I have a strong opinion about what it is that I want to accomplish. So that inherently sets up conflict, right? Jeff inherently has liabilities that he has to hold as a structural engineer, which I'm hiring him to keep me out of trouble too, for the same reasons. So inherently, I want him to be difficult in some ways, right? It's like difficult is not the right word, but I want him to push back and be that sound of resistance. But I think within that mix is where you find the collaboration is there because you have to be open-minded and vulnerable enough to say, okay, well, this is what I want as an architect, but I need this other person's input in order for me to make it reality. And if I'm open to the idea that that resistance is going to make the project better, which we talked about earlier, it's all about the project, then that resistance is welcome and it's open. So it sounds like your question is trying to asking like where we're ever at an impasse. I don't think in 15 years of working together, I've ever been at an impasse with Jeff or KL&A or any of his team. It's just not the nature of how we work.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm the same way. I don't think we've ever been at an impasse. We've always been able to work things through. Supporting each other, I think, is a large portion of that. And I don't know, there's been some projects like we were doing a sculptural set of park pavilions one time. And this was very early on in the years of mass timber and CLT material. And everybody was trying to learn it. And Ken had this notion of, oh, these CLT panels, we can shape them and form them and do everything that we can. And oh, yeah, we can do all this stuff. Look, we don't even have to do stuff because we can warp and drainage. And so it was a new material. Everybody was learning about it. And we were learning together about it, including the cost things associated with it. And we were learning about the fabrication side of that material. And that was one, just like I think embarking on a new challenge together where everybody is learning, I think is maybe the most stressful time, I think, maybe for me, but still, it was a collaborative thing. It was both of us were learning and teaching one another, and our client and the contractor, and all this kind of stuff. So,
and they ended up being steel framed instead of CLT.
Yeah, I think they didn't even really build the sculptural pieces, right?
No, we had a lot of fun exploring things.
Yeah.
I always like to, there's a half truth to this, but it's also a way that I use to diffuse things, is that I always tell people that I'm an architect, so I know just enough to be dangerous because we know so much about everything, but are we necessarily experts in any one thing? And that's why we rely on our collaborators. And so, yeah, that's one of those instances where I remember that project. I still am. I still love the idea of CLT and what we were doing. But over the years, Jeff and I have also, pointed out to each other that there are rules to using CLT. And at that time in that collaboration, I didn't know what those rules were. I just thought they were like sheets of wood that we could just like sculpt together. But that isn't exactly how they work, right? So, but we continue that investigation together fairly frequently.
Yeah.
You're taking me down memory lane a bit because I do recall, I'm not going to name my professor, but I had a classic experience where a professor walked over to my desk and flipped my model upside down and like consider that. And I was like, oh my God, I very frustrated, but it actually was the right move. It was a very fascinating way to challenge the design project at the time. I expect because there's always this respect and this trust that both of you have in terms of like testing those limits that very often unexpected things come up for the good. I was just curious if there's any that's memorable that like came out of one of these, let's say, contentious moments where you're testing and pushing the design envelope, where and really unexpected behavior or collaboration that really informed how you looked at it moving forward. We'd love to know if there was one of those moments.
I mean, I think just like any personal relationship, there's times that you get frustrated, and there's all, as architects and engineers, we're delivering, whether it doesn't matter if it's a kitchen or 100,000 square foot building or greater. There are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or millions of decisions that have to be made, and forces and give and take and all these kinds of things. And they can all become incredibly frustrating at times. And we're all human beings. And I mean, there's definitely been times that I've seen Jeff frustrated. I'm sure he's seen me frustrated. And early on in a really working relationship, I think it's hard to allow yourself to express that frustration. I think with a long-standing working professional relationship, it's much easier to express the frustration. And then over the years, I think we've both gotten good at expressing why we have that frustration so that we can help each other solve it. And I think that's definitely, as I get older and more mature in leadership, that's with all my team. That's with anybody and everybody. I'm always personally trying to figure out what's the root of the frustration that's there. And it may not be what I think it is. And I think it's enough to be, you have to be vulnerable enough to ask the question, can we pause? What's really frustrating you? What's the issue? Because I have my expectation of what's trying to get accomplished, but there could be 10, 20, 30, hundreds of other issues behind the scenes that I'm not even aware of, especially Jeff as a discipline different than architecture, but a collaborator is looking at that I'm not aware of. So I think that's been the one eye opener for me just over the years of collaboration in general, is that comes back to that whole issue of vulnerability.
I think the most special moments that come to my mind are really when other people on the team are working through it and they've seen Ken and I go through battle together and come out the other side, and we're eager to do it again. Is to see the next generation or two generations from now start to have those experiences as well. Everybody's constantly working, trying to figure things out, and when they have those special moments that they truly like, I don't know, it's the hook, that kind of keeps them in the industry. One thing that we work really hard to do is, focus on our people, because our industry needs really good, smart, talented, caring people.
Jeff, given that you've seen both sides of the discipline, I'd love to open up a conversation about what each discipline misunderstands about the other. What do architects misunderstand about engineers and vice versa?
I mean, everybody's a little different, right? So I would just kind of say that. But for me, and I didn't practice architecture, but I went to architecture school, got a degree, and decided maybe try some engineering, see where that takes me. Like I was talking about earlier, the why behind it, right? I'm really interested in knowing the more deeper kind of meaning of the project. Because one of my mentors very early on said, Jeff, you better ask, what color is that beam going to be? I was like confused. I'm like, wait a minute, what are we doing? What are we talking about? But he was completely right. Brant was completely right that that beam at some point, the color of it is going to have an impact on structure, right? Maybe not directly or something, but just being inquisitive and being thoughtful about it. So to the architects out there, be open to those ideas, be open to those questions, right? I think that typically the engineering industry, it's a science-based thing, so we are curious, and so understanding the fundamentals behind what we're doing is interesting to us, right? It allows us to help further the process, make the process better.
I mean, I think, your question ultimately will misunderstand about engineers and vice versa. is a lot of times architects just assume that engineers are conservative in their approach to something. Like, oh, does that beam really have to be that big? Or why do I have to do this much to it? And the owners, reps, and clients, everybody also tends to think sometimes the same thing. And Jeff and I had this conversation recently, and Jeff was, this is a good example of our collaboration, was very quick at enlightening me on the codes and the impacts that there are out there that he has to work within, that we're all working within too, but how narrow of a margin that he's allowed to work within versus what the canon of architecture has had for so long. You look at the canon of architecture and incredibly thin blade ceilings and glass walls holding up load bearing. I mean, and yeah, those things can work. And as architects, that's what we're always pushing to want to do. But then the perception is that there's always this like, oh, well, now you got to put this giant column in the middle of your view in order to hold that up. And we can't do anything else other than that, et cetera, which KL&A and Jeff's team has never been that way. But I think that is, as a sort of a general concept, I think a lot of architects tend to think that engineers are somehow conservative unless you get the best engineers that can really think outside the box. And it was just enlightening for me to understand, like, those are there's, again, going back to what are the forces that's, no pun intended, the forces, but what are the political forces and the code forces and all those things that we're all dealing with that are also outside of, my exact discipline at the moment.
Yeah, and I imagine that kind of the opposite side, overcoming that myth of the engineer's only mind is conservative. I imagine that in your projects, Jeff has brought to the table some of the magic of what the science of structure can actually afford for architects, that as a dangerous generalist, that an architect may not have the full awareness to understand, okay, we can actually do that kind of a condition with structure. I'd love to know if there's an example that comes to mind about like a architectural structural feat that Jeff brought to the table that the architects had no idea was even possible.
Well, we've done some pretty interesting cantilevers and floating assemblies. Like I said, we've done a lot of adaptive reuse. I mean, there was a project that I was hell bent on trying to reuse the open web joists and things like that. And Jeff was able to convince me that just replacing them with bigger beams worked better. And we reused the joist to stiffen another part of the building. And then we got this large cantilevered canopy that we were looking for out of it. We also, in the heat of COVID, we had to do a Kiddie Academy project that should have been a steel frame building. But for budgetary reasons, we ended up doing a wood building out of it. And I think there were a lot of places that I was very concerned about. In my head, probably actually I was the one that over-engineered things. And I think Jeff and his team, the woman who was the project manager at the time on that project, was a wonderfully gifted, I think she had a high-rise background, and she was bringing all kinds of really cool ways of connecting things and doing things in the sculptural canopy that we put on the outside of it. So that was that's a good example where, just the different systems have different potentials. And that was a building that had a really elegant two-story playground. It was an urban daycare that they had to have playground space. And the only way we could do it was to stack them top and bottom. And so we created this steel structure with a perforated screen around it with very playful colors, to Jeff's point about what color is it. And there's a 3 different colored skin system that was around it. And we had to marry that wood frame to that steel building, and that interface between them was also something that was a very complicated, seemingly simple building, but had very complicated implications to it that Jeff and his team made very clear to us. And we ended up celebrating those connections, were something that we started to celebrate in the architecture, which I think prior to that, we would have just blended it all together.
I want to say, like, we talked a lot about collaboration and working together, and I think like it's extraordinarily insightful to hear those stories. I'm now really curious, what's one thing you would not do anymore based on your experience? Hopefully what you share will be really, really helpful for everyone and also understand, like, it could be something that you just didn't know and tried it, didn't like it, and not gonna try that again.
Well, it's kind of a two things. One is I don't know if I would ever go back to a completely 2D based production process, like just straight CAD. I think BIM and 3D visualization is huge. That being said, I think we talked about a little bit earlier, is there's still nothing to beat a piece of paper and sitting down and collaborating with a piece of paper. And I think the downside of the whole 3-dimensional modeling that we do is that I think the younger generations are starting to lose the sensibility of spatial composition and the things that come from studying something elevation by elevation, line by line, relationship to relationship, because it's become so much about, orbiting a model. You think you see the space, you understand it, granted, there's a huge asset to that three-dimensional piece, but at some point, all of a sudden, the elevation is there just so that you can document it. And I'm not sure that the elevation or the section gets studied the way that it deserves or wants to be. So I think we're always pushing to, in some ways, slow down a little bit and take those things and stop and think about them and understand the relationships, the proportions, the connectivity, those very architectural things, but also they become the human things. And I think that's, so I guess on one hand, it's like, I don't want to go back to 2D, but I do. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. It's like a double-edged sword. And I think, Jeff, you and I sketch a lot with each other to figure out structural assemblies and details and things. And I even have just looking at some Jeff sketches right now. It's just huge, right? So I never want to give that up.
Yeah, there's a different thought process for me anyway when I'm holding a pen and sketching, drawing, rather than drawing something in Bluebeam or any other program. Revit, we use Revit here on 100% of our projects. And there's just a little bit of a mindset in terms of when you're producing in that realm. And even as an engineer, looking at a client's model, there's a certain sense of completeness, I think, that you get by seeing these 3D models that were to use collaboratively back and forth. But I think there is an inherent kind of natural human phenomenon that people want to believe that something is completed when they're looking at that model. But we just kicked off design development last week. So, well, hold on, slow down. Let's not draw 30 details around that corner just yet, because things are going to change. Things are going to, move around and shift around. So, I think a lot of that is a long way of, coming to answer your question of the one thing I wouldn't do, and I would encourage other people not to do, is to not ask the dumb question. Once again, about curiosity, right? This looks really complete. It's been like this, for 3 weeks now. Before it had been moving around a lot. Hey, is this good to take a dive into and give you some feedback on the structure? And what are your, what could we do right now to help you make some decisions somewhere in the building? Just asking for that feedback. Don't be afraid. Be vulnerable. Ask the dumb question sometime just to be sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I also want to go back a second to, so we were talking about technology earlier. AI is something that's coming, and I am of that generation where my career, my education started fully analog for a little bit, and then it was like all digital, and then now 20 some years of practice where it's everything in between. And I love the idea of new technologies. So don't get me wrong. When I say like the younger generation is losing something, they also are bringing something massive to the table that we don't have, right? And their facility with these new tools that I don't have, but I'm yearning to and always using. And like we talk about AI in our office a lot right now. And I'm actually really optimistic about these new technologies are going to even facilitate even more for us. And it's going to give us even more power in the AEC industry to do really amazing things. But like to Jeff's point, they're also the kind of thing where I can go into Midjourney and give it a statement, and I can get something that looks like it's totally finished. And it's just a sketch. And I think we just have to recognize that that is just a sketch that AI helped us with. We still have to take that to reality. And that whole process, whether it's using Rhino, Revit, SketchUp, pen and ink, chipboard models. I mean, if you were in my office, you would see we have chipboard models, basswood models as part of our process everywhere, which we've actually been doing less and less of because of the rise of the Revit. But I think it's a big piece of our ethos to do that kind of stuff. So go back to the question, I don't know if there's anything that I would say that I would never go back to, other than I just like the idea of all of the tools and things that we've had that we're pushing forward with. And it's not at the sake of giving up one for something else. It's always about using the tool that's needed at the time for the problem that's at hand. And that could be figuring out the detail. It can be visualization. It could be Rhino and Grasshopper to use scripting and algorithms to do thousands of joints on something, all of that in any given case. But it's not like leaning into it as well, this is who we are. We always do everything in Grasshopper. I mean, it's just a tool, just like a pen.
I love how we're ending on like architecture, architects, engineers. Our toolkits are just expanding for that. Like you have a large toolkit. You have a larger toolkit today than you did 5 years ago, than 10 years ago, than 20 years ago. Don't forget, it's a toolkit. Use the right tool for the right job when you need it. And imagine that toolkit will continue to grow as new technology comes.
Yeah. Don't use a hammer to dig a hole, right?
No, don't do that. And don't use your bare hands to dig a hole. Like there's a
Right.
thing called a shovel.
And I think what Ken said there is really important is give room for your staff or your employees, for your teams to explore different ways to use them. It can create some pretty amazing things for you.
Absolutely.
We know architects and engineers are working all the time on projects, lots of projects at the same time. And we'll continue this conversation in future episodes as well. Jeff and Ken and Robert, thanks so much for this great conversation.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite.